Hi there, I'm Annie East and I'm delivering a lecture with you today about risk assessment. And this is Ashley Woodfall.
Hello, we're employing some quite, social distancing here, as you can see. And yeah, I'm here because my background is as a camera operator, then director and producer. And in those roles, risk assessment was highly important to me because a lot of the work I engaged with had some significant risk attached to it.
Yeah, and I'm here because I'm a first assistant director on big drama productions, low budget features, but also BBC drama productions as well. So I've worked with crews who can be about 70 people in a crew. So when you have big scales like that, you tend to have a bigger, larger amount of risks attached to your production. Okay, so
what are we doing, Annie? What are we doing?
Yeah, we're going to be, in this session, briefly introducing CISO, about your kit booking, which is equipment, introducing the Media Skills Passport very briefly, looking at audiovisual production and health and safety, civil and criminal law, risk estimation, identifying hazards, BE risk assessment process, and general production awareness.
Righty-ho. So CISO is, you'll get to know CISO in great depth over your time with us. It does two very big jobs for us here. One of them, it manages the booking of equipment, so it's where we reserve book equipment, and it also handles risk assessment. But must be always remember to keep those two things at a distance from each other. You won't be able to get kit out unless your work is risk assessed, but we need to think they are different processes. But kit booking, risk assessment are different processes. The link is there on the top of that slide for registering on CISO, which you'll need to do. And you'll notice down the right of the screen, there's some useful links to videos to guide you around CISO. But we'll be supporting on CISO over the next few weeks.
Thank you. So we're going to provide some links with this PowerPoint. So if you actually go into the actual PowerPoint rather than the video of the PowerPoint, which is us, you can click on this link and have a look at that. It's a viral short, very sort of 18-second short to have a look at. It's to do with an accident. So when you're going through the PowerPoint, do click on that link and it'll give you a bit of context about health and safety at work. And when you're watching that video, thinking about, what are the things that you could have put in place if you were managing that bar? It's actually a pub, a bar.
So should they pause the PowerPoint now and go
You could pause this now and you can go and watch it.
And then come back?
Nice. Okay.
Okay.
Paused. Right, you're back in the room. Okay, so why health and safety? Because as humans, hopefully we have a survival instinct, but it's our acts and habits which sometimes lead us to have accidents. So it's an image here of people crossing the road looking at their phones. Might be familiar to you that you might sometimes have walked into things or tripped over things, perhaps if you were looking at a device. Okay, so it's your habit that perhaps is leading to an accident. And obviously obstructions and various other things that are sort of coming towards us can become hazardous as well. So the law, at work we have to adhere to the Health and Safety at Work Act, 1974.
Great year, 1974.
Brilliant year of flares and things like that. Again, you can spend a bit of time just looking at this slide, either on the PowerPoint slide or on this video. Just think about perceptions of risk and these 3 points here. All three of them seem to say the same thing, those statements. But it's much to do with the way we are as individuals. And so for you, it's about thinking about your perceptions of risk compared to someone else's perceptions of risk. And then also thinking about what that's going to be like in a group environment. Why do you need to care about this? Well, we expect your independent practical work to be an active space. It might be an active research space. It might be audio projects, event projects, film shoots, all sorts of different exciting things. But we expect Bournemouth University students to treat it as if it's a place of work. The Health Safety at Work Act. I know you've been clamouring, you've been wanting me to explain it to you. I'm going to explain it to you briefly now. If you want to read it, it's a 30-page document, but actually this is the bit in bold here that you want to be really thinking about. Okay, so while you're at work, you need to take reasonable care for the health and safety of himself. So that's the throwback to the 1970s when this was written, where it was always him quite often in the law, other persons who may be affected by us and by our own acts or omissions. And the other thing is you need to work out what things you'll put in place so far as reasonably practicable. Okay, so we can't imagine, sometimes we can't imagine unforeseen weather events or whatever. So it's so far as reasonably practicable, we can put various things in place. And for you guys, the Bournemouth University Health and Safety Policy, everyone has a responsibility to exercise a common law duty of care. So basically what I'm saying is you're looking out for each other at all times. And obviously at the moment, where we are at the moment with COVID-19, that's kind of raised to another level, but useful actually, and it makes us think about ourselves and how we interact with people. You can pause on this one. I won't go into it in too much detail, but this is to remind you what the contract is once you signed up to come to Bournemouth Uni. There's this contract you have with us, and this is what you've signed up to behave safely, basically. That's your contract with BU. So have a little pause and read that.
Here's where it starts getting a bit heavy.
Yes, it does get heavy. So the law can be enforced in many ways. The top one there is the Health and Safety Executive, the HSE. There's various other authorities that can enforce law. The Environmental Health will be one of them. They're the ones that shut down the parties. Although the police sometimes do that as well. Okay, so that's the enforcement of law, and reporting of injuries at the bottom there, disease and dangerous occurrences, is perhaps something that's sort of raised in our awareness at the moment. So, in the UK, the law is we tend to be innocent until proven guilty, right? Wrong in health and safety. We have to prove our innocence. And there are there's different liabilities. There's criminal liability and civil liability. And this is written here in layman's terms. I'm not a lawyer. This is written in terms that I understand, so hopefully you understand. So you can be prosecuted by the police for criminal liability. You might receive a fine, a criminal record, potentially a prison sentence. Criminal offence is when the rules governing society are broken. The civil liability is when someone injures themselves and the manager responsible for health and safety has not taken the precautions they should have. So each party may bring its own action against that person. So you may have heard about when people go for compensation. That's usually via civil liability, but both actions can be brought. So worth knowing about those things. Again, you can come back to this slide and read it in great detail, but this is the tort law of how how we could get prosecuted is for negligence. Okay, so when we're thinking about health and safety, we're always thinking about how we're evidencing how we're doing things well. And that's why we're writing, in one way, we're writing a risk assessment, because we're kind of thinking about our project work, our production work, and we're actually evidencing it by writing it down or, putting it into a CISO risk assessment. And there are various scary penalties. Maximum penalty in the Magistrates' Court is an unlimited fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months or both. And Crown Court, maximum penalty is unlimited fine or imprisonment not exceeding 2 years or both. So unlimited fines are not good. That recently got changed. It used to have a cap on it, but now that's been lifted. And obviously, we don't want to be going down the road of prison sentences. So this is why we need to think about our actions when we're working. We have to think about our production activity as a workplace. That's both in pre-production and the production, and if you're in a situation where you've got post-production as well, that's all workplace. But you need to record your hazards in a risk assessment. And why? Because firstly, we want to keep people safe. We don't want people injured or getting ill. But also, secondly, we need to be able to prove our innocence should we need to demonstrate it.
Can I chip in a point there, Annie, if I can? So
Yes, come over.
often there's another little confusion that happens around risk assessments with people who are beginning doing risk assessments. And sometimes they start putting risk assessment in measures against damage to equipment. They're thinking about the costs to the production, but actually the headline is about people. It's about harm to us and others, and that's what's at the heart of all of this. Stepping back out.
Okay, you can look at this afterwards, or you can, if you're looking through the PowerPoint version of this, you'll be able to click on the link. This is I think it's 2014. There's a focus puller called Sarah Jones on an American film called Midnight Rider, and she was fatally injured on a railway track, and there is the link describes it quite graphically what was happening, because they didn't get permissions to be on that railway track. And the reason I want you to go away and watch that is because I think sometimes we think we don't need to get permissions for things. We'll just go and do our production work somewhere and hope no one will notice. And in this case, a very big production didn't get the right permissions in place. And there were multiple permissions you needed to be on that railroad. And it resulted, and that was pressure from the sort of director and the producer to make these crew members continue filming. And this very dedicated crew member was continued to film, and a very famous actor was also on the railway track there as well. And a train came, and she did not get out of the way quick enough and received fatal injuries.
So if I can underline something here, which is we don't do guerrilla filmmaking. So you have got effectively most of the time a perfectly good camera with you, I'm sure, on your mobile phone. And you're probably used to just picking up bits of filming left, right and centre without thinking through necessarily formally thinking through the risks. That is not the way we work here. We work in professional ways. We work in ways that are going to get you jobs. That you'll be able to talk about when you go for interviews and say, look, you understand risk assessment fully and professionally. So underline that. There's no guerrilla filmmaking on any of our programs. Everything follows the appropriate and professional processes, which we're explaining.
Yes, agreed. So go and have a look at that. Clip. So, what is a hazard? What is a risk? Well, this is fairly obvious. A hazard is something that has the potential to harm you. So you could be standing next to the sea and you can see either a dolphin or a shark in there. There is something.
I've never seen it as a dolphin.
No, well, it kind of really is a shark, isn't it? But I mean, you're not quite sure, but you're standing by the seashore. But it is a hazard. The risk is the likelihood of that hazard, which is a shark, eating you. Okay, so keep those two things in your mind, because you will need to be in a situation where you can identify what a hazard is and then also identify what the risk is, because those are two very separate things, but obviously completely interlinked, because the CISO risk assessment will ask you to identify the hazard and then what's the risk of that thing harming you or members of the public or your crew. Okay, so in which case you can pause this, because you will need to look at this in some detail, this image here, and just go through in that image, what can you see that's a hazard and what's the risk there of that thing or that person actually making a risk of something bad happening.
Can we think of an example in there, just to isolate one for...
Yes, I can. So what I can see is lots of trailing cables and
That's
running
the hazard.
running children there. So I'm going to pick up those two things.
Mm-hmm.
So the hazard is the trailing cables, and the risk is tripping over them. And in fact, the children themselves are hazards just because they're children. But you can see actually potentially the risk kind of playing out there. Okay, so the hazard is the trailing cables, and the risk is tripping over and cracking heads over.
So pause there.
Pause. And we're back in the room. Okay, so hazard identification, some methods. So this is something you'll be doing a lot earlier on now that we have COVID-19 with us. And COVID-19, thinking about that alongside all these other risks like trailing cables and children and things like that, they will need to be thought about very early on and when you're creating your ideas. But ways that you will identify those hazards will be during your seminars, during production meetings with your peers, tutorials with tutors, etc. Project analysis, breaking down that idea and script. So again, picking out from your fabulous idea what might occur. Undertaking a recce and photos. I'm going to hand over to you talking about the recce now.
Oh, okay, yeah. So historically, we would insist, in professional practice and of course on our courses that a recce would happen physically. I would go out on the recce, for example, and I'd be taking photographs there. I'd be discussing access and all sorts of things with the people there. But what the industry's moved towards, and what we're moving towards, of course, then is we're trying to do recce's remotely. So we may be using something like Google Street View to do a certain amount of work, or we may be asking someone who's on the location, who maybe owns the location or has access to the location, to video conference us in, for example. So we're moving to remote recce's for this year.
Yeah, I put in, so thank you. I put in brackets health records of crew and cast. It's something that the production industry would do, but there's a lot of GDPR around that. We're finalising the process for, checking for people with COVID symptoms, but we don't necessarily need to ask people's health records. We just need to ask if they've got the current symptoms or that they don't have the current symptoms, sorry. So that would be checking what those current symptoms are on the government websites, etc. So we are inquiring after people's health, but we're not asking for their records. And expert guidance might be something. So if you were, wanting someone to do run a drone for you or something like that, so expert guidance can help identify those hazards. So health safety guidelines, again, spend some time looking at this slide, but in bold there, where the producer delegates performance of key stages of production to suitably competent individuals, it's their responsibility. So that's actually saying things like, if you've learnt how to use a specialist piece of equipment, which might be as you move through your degree, you might get access to more specialist pieces of equipment. Don't assume that your producer or production manager, whoever is responsible for sort of that side of things, will know what the safe practice is for the risk assessment. Surely the expert in that area would then need to feed into that. So that's where the risk assessment becomes a group collective, but someone's heading it up. Okay. So do we want to quickly talk to this?
Okay. So when we're conducting risk assessments, we have certain processes or steps that we would want to follow. We're going to introduce you to a very straightforward mnemonic in a minute, which will really help pin this stuff down. But we talked about hazards. You start by identifying your hazards. Sometimes they're blooming obvious, sometimes they require a bit of discussion. And so one of the things we recommend in all risk assessment, you don't do it on your own. And we have processes in place to make sure this stuff comes to the surface through dialogue. So identify the hazard, decide who might be harmed and how they might come to harm in relation to that hazard. And then you have to think about and evaluate the risks and what precautions, and you'll hear the word mitigation a few times come through. So we're talking about the mitigation that we could put in place to make this safer to make this something we can actually do. Because there will be occasions when we go through this process and we decide, actually, we're not going to do this at all because we don't think we can address this fully and make it completely safe. But we won't know that until we've gone through the process. So, hazards, who might be harmed, how, evaluate risks, think about the precautions, the mitigation you can put in place, and then record the findings through the risk assessment. Now, Annie's already mentioned, we're recording the findings so we can get this risk assessment signed off, so we can do the production. But we're also making a record of this because this is effectively our legal positioning if there's ever a problem as well. So there's a defensive side to the risk assessment. It's not a bad way to think about it. There's the creative end of it, the practical end of getting your thing done. And if there's ever a kick-off, you can show you've thought this through properly. Stepping out.
So, those are 5 steps to risk assessment. We will come back to that slide a little bit later. Okay, so Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, 2009. Some of you may have seen all of the Harry Potters. Some of you might find them abhorrent. You may not like them. But David Holmes was a stunt double for Daniel Radcliffe. And something went very wrong in the communication between the stunt coordinator, the stunt person themselves, so that's 2 separate people, and the visual effects people, I believe. And so he was on what's called a jerk back rig manoeuvre, where Harry Potter is being thrown into a wall, and you have a harness on, and you're jerked back into a softer wall than normal, but it's definitely jerked back. Now that rigging mechanism and that pulley was weighted for someone who was about 12 stone. I know this anecdotally, just through other people I know who sort of linked to the stunt performers in the UK. So this is an anecdote, effectively.
Is it an anecdote?
It's an anecdote. Not an antidote, it's an anecdote. So, and it was weighted for someone of around 12 stone, whereas I believe David Holmes was a lot lighter than 12 stone. So therefore, he was paralysed from the neck down. He's still alive. You can look that up. Certainly do a little Google search and just find out a bit more about that, if you can. But the lesson there is about communication. So whilst you may not be doing stunts in that same way, you will need to communicate with all the different sort of departments or people who are helping you make your production. So do think about what happened there, which was a breakdown of communication and thinking you don't need to tell somebody something. Keep the communication going the best you can. Similarly, another more recent accident is on the Star Wars set with Harrison Ford, and it was in the Millennium Falcon door, so it's the more recent Star Wars films. He had his leg crushed. It was a hydraulic door that came crashing down, and he pressed the button to shut the door, but during rehearsals the door hadn't been live. And then they went for a final rehearsal and the door button became live and it did its hydraulic thing that came down, and he didn't expect it to be live. And the director shouted cut, and so he decided to go back in, and that's when the door came down. So lucky he didn't die, basically. The point about that is, the judge, you can see what the judge is saying there. Is about communication. So, the judge said back in 2016, the greatest failing of all on behalf of the company is the lack of communication. Because if you have a risk assessment and you don't communicate it, I'm just saying to be the judge here, if you have a risk assessment and you don't communicate it, what is the point of having one? I mean, that is absolutely the point. The risk assessment is not a sort of box-ticking exercise that just shut me up and we let you go and do filming. It's actually completely essential that people know what the things are, and the fact that various things are happening now that weren't happening in a rehearsal, for instance. And that could have resulted in someone dying. And what's interesting also about this, if you want to kind of look again, sort of Google it and find out more about it, the company, they're called Foodles, but it's the Star Wars, it's Lucasfilm or whoever it is, but it's called Foodles. They had a separate company. Hydraulic door clearly can have safety mechanisms. Yes, we know this. We've been into lifts, and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully when a lift door shuts, it's not going to crush you and it will sort of open again. We have this experience. This technology is available, but the reason they didn't use it, because of money. Okay, even some of the biggest movie companies are looking ways to save money, and sometimes making those savings and not following through with good practice, then accidents can happen. So we're going to identify the hazards, and you can have a look at that, potential outcomes and the likelihood. So we've got to think about these two things. Is it minimal and unlikely? Is it minimal but likely? Is it serious but possible? These are things you need to think about. I'm going to hand over to Ashley for these next two slides because they're his slides. They're his ideas.
Yeah, so I'm interested in these two slides in a particular way, because we might look at that slide there where we've, maybe like a meteorite hitting the Earth and say, that's a significant thing that we would need to take account of. But of course, when we think about it, that's not something we would be putting into a risk assessment, however life on Earth ending it might seem. Whereas that is something that could make it into a risk assessment, even though it seems maybe insignificant. Actually, if you were walking along that pavement now, facing forward,
looking at your phone,
possibly you could trip up. But if you were walking backwards with a camera on your shoulder and you didn't put in place some mitigation around tripping up, you're moving into actually a high likelihood of something happening. So the potential outcome of this is you might hurt your back, fall over, It's not end of life on Earth territory, but the likelihood is high. Whereas the other one here, yes, actually the outcome pretty chunky, likelihood low. And I hope that sort of helps differentiate between those.
Okay, yes. So that's really useful to think about. And of course, the other thing you're going to start working through is, who is walking along that? Is it a camera person walking backwards, or are you, recording some audio and you've got to walk backwards because you're recording someone chatting who's walking forwards? Or are you working with someone who's more elderly? So this is where we start to think about we're going to take you into the next section, which is to do with mnemonic.
It's a word.
Mnemonic.
Isn't it? Yes.
It is. It's a word. So that's our 5 steps to risk assessment. So once we're thinking about that, we also want you to start thinking about this. PEAT.
Hey, hello, Pete.
The acronym is PEAT.
Pete isn't the name of that big eagle.
No, we should name that big eagle Pete.
Yes.
That is Pete. Okay, so use this, have it in your brain when you're writing up a risk assessment, or when you're thinking about hazards and risks. People can present a type of risk, or they can be a risk to themselves, or they're vulnerable. You're a risk to them. So we're thinking about an elderly person, for instance. You might be a risk to them for many different reasons. You might be asking them to be in an environment, and at the moment we're thinking about COVID-19, so we're thinking about our risk to other people a lot, aren't we? And what we can put in place to stop that being a risk or a hazard. So equipment could be a risk depending on what you're using. So think about what you're using. And maybe there's extra props or extra things you're bringing in, so it may not be just your production or filming or audio equipment. There might be other things. What's the task? What is the actual project you've been asked to work on? What are you physically doing? And the environment. So where are you? What are you doing? And at the moment we're thinking about our environment a lot. Are we in well ventilated spaces? Are we outside? Are we outside but we're on the side of a cliff? So that's safe in a COVID sense, but it's not in a sort of I might fall off a cliff kind of way. So and equally, are we inside? We shouldn't be finding ourselves inside small spaces, cramped, perhaps student halls, those sorts of student halls, areas that are kind of small, narrow corridors. We shouldn't be thinking about our production work as the first thing to do in those spaces, because you're going to immediately have to think about distance. So but maybe you're in a large huge lecture theatre and you've just got one or two people in that huge space. So interior and exterior spaces have now got extra layers for you to think about when you're thinking about your environment. So environment's really important. So Pete, use that and always remember it. So yeah, hooray for acronyms. So that's an image there, which is from Doctor Who, popular UK sort of family program. Some of you might love it, some of you might hate it. But the image here this is filmed in a quarry. They're using a lot of smoke for effect. You've got someone on a ladder pod there. So we want to know if they're going to be harnessed at all. So if the hazard is they're up high, they're working at heights. And the risk is that they might fall or they might drop something on somebody else below them. So we always remember that when we're working slightly at height. There's various other things here you can look at. So it's an uneven ground. So if someone was coming to that particular production set wearing perhaps stilettos or something like that, or different types of footwear or flip-flops, for instance. Maybe it's not the right kind of footwear for that environment. So again, those are things to be thinking about. And Pete can help you identify in this picture various other things. There's other things you could pick out there yourselves. The hierarchy of controls is a classic kind of health and safety thing. And you can see at the top there with this triangle, we're always looking to sort of eliminate if we can. So take it out completely, the risk. But then we go down and down into the sort of little red one at the bottom, which is PPE, which quite often in past years we haven't really had to think about as much, but of course PPE now is very much the word or the acronym personal protective equipment. And some of the mitigations we're putting in place in certain production spaces at Bournemouth University, we're thinking about PPE, and that's more in a sort of COVID-19 sense. But equally, if you were filming in a working quarry, for instance, and you're working or you're filming or doing some audio work on an actual live building site, for instance, you would be required to wear a hard hat. I can.
And he's got a hard
yes,
hat.
I've got one. Yes. So
I'm just waving, just filling time here. So Annie goes and gets her.
So there you go. Doesn't actually fit, but there we go. But yes. So that's the hierarchy of controls. The BU risk assessment process, again, just spend some time sort of coming to terms with this. But you need to have completed a risk assessment online using the CISO online system. CISO stands for Stock In, Stock Out. So essentially, it's about the equipment that you can get out at university. But what's also very useful, as Ashley said earlier, it has this very, very good interface that creates risk assessments, and the two things talk to each other. So that's good. So that's why we use it. Some people, other productions might use Word documents and things to create a risk assessment. You won't be. You'll be making sure that you have registered on CISO, you have an account, and you will do it on there. You must have that risk assessment completed and agreed within certain time periods, and that is stated on your unit brief. So you will need to check that. So the night before, if you suddenly go, risk assessment, you won't get it signed off, you won't be able to get any kit out, or you won't be allowed to film with your own kit. Yes, so it's the same thing. You won't be able to do your production activity. So be aware of what those time periods are. Without an agreed risk assessment, production kit will not be issued either. So, and you must clearly communicate. Remember we talked about Harrison Ford and David Holmes on Harry Potter. You need to communicate it. You need to distribute it. People need to be aware of it. And you might want to do what we call a toolbox talk at the beginning of each production event, at the beginning of the day. Just say what the highlights are on that risk assessment. Just don't assume people have read it, although everyone's responsible for themselves and they should have done. So, we're covering all bases. The production manager or a nominated person, so you will need to decide who that is, ensures that it's adhered to throughout the shoot activity, and everyone is responsible for their own safety and others around them. And you share that responsibility for the production. You're looking out for each other. The PDF of the agreed risk assessment must be submitted along with the work for assessment. So when you're actually uploading your production work, and it's part of an assessed piece of work, you will need to upload that PDF as well. And accidents occur because of multiple factors. It's not usually just one thing. There's usually a sort of a series of things that have gone wrong. So sometimes that might be a last minute good idea where we're not communicating the changes, to all the relevant people. And I think perhaps in maybe in your student production work, you might have a lot of last minute good ideas. And when you do have those ideas, you've got to stop and reassess and go, what does this mean for everybody? And what does this mean for risk? And does it actually take you away from what you pledged and what you signed off? Because if you go away from the risk assessment, that's where the law becomes, looking at, what did you sign off with your tutors? And then what you ultimately did was not what you said you'd do. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, so for your first work with us, we expect you to stick to the risk assessment as signed off. So you're not going to be making changes on the fly without a new risk assessment that has then been signed off again. So you stick with what you've got. Just underlining that, because there are approaches later in the time when you're with us and out into professional practice, which are called dynamic risk assessments, where we can take a slightly different stance. But for now, it's what's signed off that happens.
Okay, thank you. And rushing to complete activities due to time constraints is quite often constraints either with people that you're working with, that, just given their time to you, or perhaps the environment you're in, the location you're in, the time constraints. Someone said, I can only give you an hour, I can only give you 2 hours, and then, you're rushing to complete something, and that can often lead to accidents. Very important, if an accident or near miss happens, stop the filming or the activity, stop your production activity immediately, stand down, apply first aid, or if there's no first aider, the nominated person must contact the relevant services. If you're on campus, that's 222. If you're off campus, it's 999. For minor accidents, taking to the hospital or the doctor, or phoning the doctor these days, rather than sort of bundling into a doctor's surgery. Inform Bournemouth University, that will be your tutor or faculty office, depending. But get that information to us. Don't continue any activity until the injury is treated and hazard is addressed. And after that event, you must complete an accident report form with your tutor. So just let us know. For every 400 unreported near misses, one bad accident happens. So it really helps us when we understand what a near miss is as well as an accident itself. So we're going to finish off now. You can, when you're looking at this in the PowerPoint, you can click on this one. This is quite fun, this dog and a firework. So click on that link in the actual PowerPoint itself and enjoy another YouTube special. And that's it from Ashley and I. Goodbye.
Lovely. Yes, what's not to like about dogs and fireworks? That's what I say. Catch you soon.